They thought I'd never see it. A message meant for my son, but written by his wife. Make sure he won't come back. No explanation, no concern, just a quiet plan to erase me from the home I helped build. What they never stopped to consider was what a battle-worn veteran is still capable of, or how unshakable a soldier's belief becomes when his dignity is tested. I didn't shout, didn't call, didn't confront them right away. I waited, because what I did next wouldn't be loud, it would be deliberate. And by the time they realized the old man they tried to push aside was still thinking clearly, still standing firmly, still very much in control, it was already too late to undo what they'd started. Before I show you the moment everything changed, tell me where you're watching from and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. So, let's dive into the story. I turned 75 this year, though my body likes to remind me of it every morning, long before the sun creeps through the curtains. The routine never changes. I wake up before the birds, sit on the edge of the bed, let the stiffness work its way out of my knees, and breathe until the ache settles into something I can tolerate. It's the same rhythm I carried through most of my life, measured, quiet, disciplined. Only now, the house answers no one but me. My name is Walter Grayson. Retired Army, 40 years behind me, and yet somehow still shaped by the habits of a younger man who once believed loyalty was as solid as steel. My life these days is simple. A small kitchen, a clean armchair by the window, a shelf of old books, and a garden I tend when the weather is kind. I don't ask much from the world anymore, only a little peace and the chance to see my son now and then. Elliot used to stop by every Sunday. We'd drink tea at the same old table where he'd once spread his school books and asked me for help with the tough questions. Somewhere along the way, those visits slowed. A missed Sunday here, a quick phone call there, and when he did come, his wife, Miranda, never quite looked at me the same way she used to when they first married. There was politeness in her voice, yes, but underneath it, something sharper, colder, like I was a habit she meant to break him of. That afternoon, Elliot had stopped by with a grocery bag and his usual distracted smile. "Just checking on you, Dad," he said, setting the bag down like it was a task crossed off a list instead of a visit to his father. He lingered by the door, tapping his phone as if somewhere else was pulling at him harder than the room we stood in. I noticed he looked tired. I noticed he didn't sit. Miranda had stayed in the car, windows rolled up, eyes flicking down at her own screen, refusing even the courtesy of a hello. I didn't comment. I never do. Instead, I asked Elliot about work, about the house, about the new shelves he once promised he'd let me help install. He nodded along, answering in half-phrases, always checking that phone. It happened in the quietest moment, when he reached across the counter to show me a photo of his backyard, the one he claimed he'd cleaned up himself. The screen flashed just a second longer than he intended, a message banner sliding across the top. "Make sure he won't come back." Those were the exact words. The name above them, Miranda. He saw it too, I could tell. His hand jerked slightly, thumb swiping the notification away with a speed too frantic to feel casual. He laughed, a thin sound with no warmth behind it. "Sorry, Dad. Work stuff," he murmured, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. I didn't ask what it meant. I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't even let my face change. Years of service had trained me in reading between lines without stepping over them. I simply nodded, as though we were still talking about garden weeds and broken hinges instead of a sentence that cut deeper than any insult spoken aloud. "Make sure he won't come back." I watched him avoid my gaze, avoid the moment, avoid the shame he must have felt. And in that silence, a somber realization settled quietly in my chest. This wasn't anger. This wasn't confusion. This was calculation, shaping itself behind closed doors, and my daughter-in-law was holding the pen. Elliot said goodbye quickly after that, shaking my hand instead of pulling me in for one of those half-hearted hugs he used to give. I stood at the door as his footsteps faded down the walkway, the echo of that message still pressing against my ribs. Back inside, the house felt larger, colder, as if the spaces had grown wider around me, rearranging themselves for solitude. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my tea, letting the steam warm my face while my thoughts stayed steady and controlled. I didn't feel fear, I didn't feel rage, only a narrow thread of sadness stitched through the quiet. Make sure he won't come back. I repeated the words once more in my mind, calmly, as if by naming them I could strip them of their power. But something told me that sentence was not a passing thought. It was a plan, and I had just seen its first breath. I folded my hands together on the table and stared at the worn grain of the wood. Whatever Miranda intended for me, whatever Elliot had been pressured into accepting, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not beg for a place in my own son's life. Not now, not ever. The change didn't arrive all at once. It came like damp settling into old walls, slow, quiet, almost polite if you weren't paying attention. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, that Elliot was simply busy, that Miranda's sharpness was just stress from juggling work and the house. I'd spent most of my life trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. Old habits die hard, but absence leaves patterns. The Sundays stopped first. No more calls to ask if I wanted to come over for dinner. When I rang Elliot instead, he'd answer with a distracted tone, voice muffled, as though he'd stepped out of a room just to keep up appearances. "Sorry, Dad, this week's a bit hectic," he'd say. "We're sorting out some stuff around the house. You know how Miranda gets when she's organizing." I did know. Miranda was precise, controlled. Everything had to fit inside the world she imagined for herself, and I was starting to understand that I didn't have a space in that picture. Then the small excuses followed. "We're repainting the guest room. The kids have friends over. We're trying something new with our schedules." Always delivered with soft politeness, always wrapped in language that sounded caring on the surface. Never once did she say, "Don't come." Instead, it became clear through repetition that my visits were now complications, not comfort. Once, out of quiet habit, I drove over anyway. I didn't announce it. Just a bag of fresh peaches from the market, the kind Elliot liked as a boy. I knocked like any guest should, even though I'd once held spare keys to that very door. Miranda opened it halfway, her smile practiced and thin. "Oh, Walter," she said, like she'd stumbled across an unexpected inconvenience instead of family. "We weren't expecting you." Behind her, I could see Elliot at the dining table, papers scattered, phone in hand. He glanced up, met my eyes, then looked away with a sudden urgency that twisted something inside me more sharply than any rude remark ever could. "We're in the middle of reorganizing some things," she continued smoothly. "You really should have called first. Elliot's swamped and the kids are overstimulated. It's just not a good time." No raised voice, no visible hostility, just measured instruction, disguised as concern. Elliot didn't cross the room. He didn't offer me a seat. All he did was murmur, "Sorry, Dad. Bad timing," without standing. I nodded. I always nod. I've stood through worse with composure. "Well," I said quietly, handing Miranda the peaches, Just thought I'd drop these off for the little ones." Her eyes flicked down briefly. "That's kind of you," she murmured, taking the bag like it was a courtesy I'd forced upon her, rather than a gift given with care. The door closed soon after. No invitation lingering in the air. No next time. Just a gentle shutting of something that once opened freely. After that, the phone calls thinned to polite check-ins, quick updates. Surface-level words meant to maintain the illusion of connection while slowly severing its depth. When I asked about the children, the answers felt brief, edited, conveniently vague. And then there was the phrasing. "Probably better if you rest at your place, Dad. We don't want you overexerting yourself. It's easier for everyone if you take it easy now." Each sentence draped in the language of care, yet wrapped tightly around the quiet message beneath it. You no longer belong in our daily life. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that families go through seasons, that pride has a way of softening with time, but the pattern grew undeniable. I had become someone to be managed, scheduled, quietly phased out of a household I once laid brick by brick with my own hands. I would sit at my kitchen table, staring at the faded photograph of Elliot as a boy, his small hand wrapped around my finger, and wonder when kindness had turned into inconvenience, when presence had become intrusion. I felt no explosion inside me, no fury, only a slow, aching clarification taking root. They weren't busy. They were removing me. There was a time when that house held my fingerprints in every corner. I remembered the day we stood in front of it together, Elliot and I, keys trembling in his hand, eyes wide with that mix of excitement and fear a young man wears when he believes he's finally stepping into adulthood. The walls had been bare then, the floors cold and echoing. He'd laughed when I ran my hand along the frame of the front door and said, "Solid bones, son. This place will outlast both of us if you treat her right." I treated it right. I helped lay the shelves in the hallway, heavy oak planks that took two of us to lift. I patched the roof after a storm split through the tiles and soaked the upstairs bedroom. When the sink backed up for the first time, I lay flat beneath it with my wrench and muttered all the old curses Miranda pretended not to hear. I planted the sapling at the corner of the yard myself, the one that now shades the children's swing. Every stain, every nail, every crack had once felt like a shared memory. I'd watched the place fill with life. Little shoes by the door, crayon on the kitchen wall, Elliot's laugh echoing down the staircase as he chased the children through rooms I'd helped build back into warmth. Miranda used to thank me back then. Her smile had been real once, I think. Or maybe I wanted it to be. Now, when I stood outside that same front door, the glass reflected someone who didn't look like he belonged there anymore. The inside had changed too. The couch replaced, the photos rearranged. My old fishing hat no longer hung on the corner peg. It was subtle, the kind of change that might pass unnoticed by anyone else, but not by the man who once held the hammer that shaped half the place. One afternoon, Elliot asked me to stop by to pick up a box of things he'd sorted through. He said it like he was returning borrowed books instead of pieces of my own past. When I walked inside, the air felt colder somehow, stripped of the warmth that had once welcomed me without question. Miranda greeted me with polite formality and guided me toward a neat pile near the hallway. A few worn sweaters, a framed photo from years ago, a set of old tools I'd left in their garage long before they decided to organize. "We thought you might want these back," she said smoothly. "We're trying to create more space for the kids, less clutter. You understand." Clutter. I picked up the frame and looked at the faded image of Elliot as a boy standing beside me in uniform, both of us smiling like the world made sense. I wondered how something that once meant home could now be reduced to something inconvenient enough to return. "I suppose I do," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the tightening in my chest. Elliot lingered nearby, distracted again, arms crossed, eyes avoiding mine. He didn't argue, didn't comfort, didn't contradict a thing his wife decided for him. As I walked through the hallway, memory clung to every step like dust. I could almost hear the echo of a younger version of him calling, "Dad, look!" when he'd finished his first homework assignment at the dining table. I could almost feel the warmth of those Sunday dinners when he'd sit across from me recounting stories from his first job, his first heartbreak, his first real taste of independence. Only now, the laughter felt far away, replaced by silence that moved comfortably between Miranda and him, as if they'd rehearsed it long before I ever noticed the change. Standing by the door, I looked back one last time, not at the walls, not at the furniture, at the absence of something that once lived there, the shared understanding that this place was built on sacrifice, not convenience. The house didn't feel hostile, it felt erased. And as I stepped outside with my box tucked under my arm, I realized the truth settling deeper into my chest with each quiet breath. That place no longer remembered me, and perhaps, in their minds, it was never meant to. The message stayed with me, not as a wound, but as a warning. I didn't go looking for more. I didn't pry into Elliot's life or shadow his movements. I simply waited, the way a soldier learns to wait when he knows something important is unfolding just beyond sight. And it came, not through confrontation, but through carelessness. It happened 2 weeks after the day I received my boxed memories. Elliot called, unusually formal in tone. "Dad, we need to talk about something," he said. "Miranda thinks it might be time for you to consider additional support. Just options. Options. The way people talk when decisions have already been made." I agreed to stop by. Not because I sensed danger, but because the calmness in his voice wasn't honesty. It was distance. Miranda didn't bother with pretense this time. She offered me tea, but never sat. Elliot hovered behind her like a shadow waiting for direction. "We're just worried about you," she said, folding her arms in a way that wasn't defensive, just final. "You're 75, Walter, living alone. Anything could happen. A fall, a lapse of memory, and we'd be blamed for not stepping in sooner." I looked at her calmly. "I've managed on my own longer than you've known me," I replied, "and I've yet to forget where I left my shoes." She smiled tightly. "This isn't about shoes. It's about safety, responsibility, planning ahead." Elliot shifted uncomfortably beside her. She continued, "We've been speaking with a family advisor. He suggested that transitioning you into a supervised residence might provide better care, just temporarily, until you feel comfortable." There it was. The words were wrapped in velvet, but the intention beneath them felt rigid, unmistakable. "Is that what you want, son?" I asked quietly, turning my eyes to Elliot. He opened his mouth, then hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. "I just want what's best for you, Dad," he muttered, voice weak. Miranda stepped in again, effortlessly. "And to make things easier, we've also considered a few legal adjustments. You gave Elliot co-signing power on the house years ago, didn't you?" she said, almost casually. "There's paperwork we can streamline to avoid bureaucratic headaches later on." My hands remained folded on my lap, but inside the air shifted. Adjustments. Streamline. These weren't caretaking words. These were control words. Later that evening, as I stood in the hallway by the door waiting for Elliot to retrieve my coat, Miranda's phone chimed on the counter. I'd never paid much attention to her business before, but the screen lit up just long enough for something specific to register before she snatched it away. A move-in timeline should be arranged quickly. The contact name read Harold & Sons Legal Consultancy. That was when the shape of it finally came into focus. This wasn't care. This wasn't family concern. It was strategy. They weren't pushing me to rest or waiting for me to accept help. They were moving me out of the equation, redrawing lines, nudging me toward the margins of a life I helped build while constructing paperwork sturdy enough to keep me from stepping back in. I drove home that night in silence, headlights gliding across forgotten side roads I knew by heart. The idea of assisted living didn't frighten me. What unsettled me was this realization. They didn't want support for me. They wanted absence. I sat on my bed when I returned, the old mattress dipping gently under my weight, and stared at the faded metal on my nightstand. It had little value to anyone else, but it reminded me of the man I had been, steady, grounded, unwilling to yield without reason. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to acknowledge it. They weren't misled. They weren't stressed. They had planned my disappearance, quietly, carefully, with paperwork instead of compassion. And as my fingers rested on the edge of that familiar metal, something inside me settled into stillness, the kind that comes before a decision, not after one. Whatever came next wouldn't be rushed, but it wouldn't be passive either. I did not sleep much that night, not because of fear, but because my mind refused the comfort of ignorance. The truth had settled too clearly for that. Miranda's words, the legal message, Elliot's silence, they had formed a pattern that no amount of kindness could erase. This was no longer about care. This was about control dressed up as obligation. Morning came softly, as it always did, and with it, the familiar rhythm returned. I made my tea. I straightened the small rug near the door. I brushed the dust from the bookshelf with the same careful motion I'd used for decades. Nothing outwardly changed, but inside something had shifted from hurt to clarity. I sat at the old desk I kept tucked beside the window and unlocked a drawer most people wouldn't even notice. Inside lay the fragments of a life built carefully and deliberately. My discharge papers, my service record, letters from officers long gone, proof of my partial ownership in the house Elliot now occupied. I hadn't touched them in years. There was no bitterness in my hands as I lifted each paper, only a quiet acknowledgement of what I'd forgotten to do, protect the dignity I once assumed would never be questioned. I remembered the day Elliot asked me to co-sign on the mortgage. He'd been young, anxious, unsure if the bank would trust him alone. I'd signed without hesitation. He was my son. The house wasn't just bricks and timber. It was continuity, legacy. Now it was leverage. I laid the documents out slowly, reading through them as if meeting an old part of myself again. The fine print, the dates, the clauses Miranda assumed no one would notice, the way old men always get underestimated, as if years reduce perception instead of sharpening it. The dull ache in my knees grew as I leaned forward, but I welcomed the discomfort. It reminded me I was still here, still thinking, still capable. I did not think of revenge. That word carries heat, and heat clouds judgment. What I thought of instead was footing, stability, the right to decide where I slept and how my name would be spoken. I poured another cup of tea and sat there for a long time, letting the silence speak as clearly as the message once had. Make sure he won't come back. Those words had been written with finality, but they underestimated one thing. They assumed my stillness meant surrender. I began making quiet notes in the margin of my legal folder, marking questions I needed answered. Ownership rights, consent validity, process interference. It was not an emotional exercise, it was procedural, like preparing for inspection, like briefing before a long mission. I realized then that I had spent too long trusting circumstance instead of structure. And while I raised my son with loyalty and patience, I had never taught him how cruel efficiency could look when camouflaged as kindness. That was my failure, perhaps. But this moment, was mine now. I glanced toward the framed photograph on the mantel shelf, the one showing me in uniform, posture straight, expression calm. I studied that face for longer than usual. That man didn't shout. He didn't plead. He acted when the time was right. And as the morning sun shifted gently across the floor, warming the space where my boots once stood, I folded my papers together with new order and purpose. Whatever Miranda believed about slow, compliant old men would soon be tested, not through fury, not through protest, but through the very quiet discipline she assumed I no longer possessed. And I knew, with a certainty that came from decades of service and hard-earned restraint, that before the week was through, she would no longer mistake silence for defeat. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed just high enough to pour a soft line of warmth across the floorboards. I stood there a moment, watching the light touch the corner where my boots rested, and I found myself thinking about men who understood order, not because they craved power, but because they respected clarity. There is a difference between silence and surrender, and there are only a few people left in this world who know the difference when they see it in a man's eyes. I reached for the old phone beside the lamp and scrolled through numbers I rarely touched anymore. Most names were gone. Time has a way of thinning that list. But one remained, clear, familiar, steady. Frank Delaney. Frank had once been my commanding officer during the later years of my service. Not a loud man, not one for ceremony. He'd been practical, sharp-eyed, and deeply respectful of structure. After retirement, he moved into legal advocacy for veterans, advising on benefits, property rights, contested claims. We hadn't spoken in nearly a year, but the bond of shared terrain never fades completely. He answered on the third ring. "Walter Grayson," he said, voice still carrying that even, disciplined timbre. "I'll be damned. How are you holding up, soldier?" "I'm not calling for chatter, Frank," I replied. "I need clarity." There was a pause, a listening pause. "Tell me," he said. And so I did. Not emotionally, not poetically, just the facts as I'd seen them. The message, the distancing, the language about support and transition. The legal firm Miranda had already contacted. I kept my tone measured because this wasn't storytelling, it was assessment. Frank didn't interrupt once. When I'd finished, there was a long breath on the other end. "You didn't imagine any of this," he finally said. "And you're right to call." "I'm not asking for revenge," I replied. "I want to know what ground I stand on." "You stand on more than you think," he said quietly. "And if your consent is being maneuvered or implied without proper authorization, that changes everything, especially if they're building a case around your capacity." That word stirred something unpleasant in my stomach. Capacity, as if my mind had downgraded with age. "I still signed the co-ownership paperwork," I reminded him. "Yes," Frank replied, "and that gives you leverage, especially if the house wasn't fully transferred through formal channels. We need eyes on that documentation. every line, every assumption she's leaning on. "I can get those," I said. "I don't doubt it," he replied. "Walter, this isn't about being cautious. It's about preventing erasure disguised as protection." I didn't speak for a moment. "So what do I do?" I asked. "We proceed with dignity and documentation. I'll handle the legal oversight." "You do nothing rash? No confrontations? No accusations? We'll let the process expose the truth instead of your temper ever having to raise a voice." He knew me well. "Are you prepared to step back in if needed?" he added. "Not emotionally, procedurally." "Yes," I said, and I meant it plainly. "Then we begin," Frank responded. "You make arrangements for a formal family discussion, something ordinary. I'll ensure the appropriate authority is present, not aggressively, not publicly, just enough to ensure clarity when the moment arrives." "When it arrives," I repeated. "Yes, and it will," he said firmly. "If they move with paperwork instead of heart, then we meet them with structure, not sentiment." We ended the call quietly. No reassurance, no drama, just alignment. I placed the phone down slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, a few leaves stirred faintly in the breeze, brushing against the glass like the passing of time itself. Nothing about the world looked shaken. That was good. A shaken world brings noisy consequences. This one still moved with balance. I felt no battle rising in my chest, no hunger to retaliate, only a narrow, clear path unfolding before me. Miranda thought she was trimming loose ends. Elliot thought he was following policy in place of instinct, but they had forgotten something fundamental. This house I'd once helped build, my home, my son's walls, their security, had its roots planted long before legal advisories and modern clauses, and those roots weren't as brittle as they had assumed. For now, I would say nothing. For now, I would let them believe I was weakening. But quietly, carefully, the ground beneath their certainty had already begun to shift, and I knew the next move would have to be deliberate, unhurried, precise. I did not rush. Men who rush make noise. Noise attracts mistakes. For the next 2 days, I behaved exactly as Miranda expected. I answered Elliot's calls when they came, spoke with smooth politeness, and nodded at every suggestion that pretended to be concern. I let the silence wrap comfortably around me because silence is often mistaken for compliance, and compliance breeds confidence. Confidence makes people careless. On Wednesday morning, I rang Elliot myself. "Son," I said calmly, "I've been thinking about what you and Miranda mentioned, about support, about arranging things properly." There was a faint pause on the other end, like a breath held just slightly too long. "That's good to hear, Dad," he said carefully. "Miranda will be relieved you're open to discussing it." "I am," I replied. "But I'd like us all in the same room. No misunderstandings, no miscommunication. I think it's best to go over everything together." "Of course," he said, voice barely concealing relief. "When were you thinking?" "Friday afternoon," I suggested. "No rush, no pressure, just family and maybe a professional to clarify what's what. Paperwork confuses me these days." It was deliberate, the subtle note of vulnerability, the implication that I was beginning to waver. "Miranda's already been in touch with a consultant," he said quickly. "She can arrange for him to join us." "Good," I said simply. "Let's do it clean." He agreed without hesitation, and when we ended the call, I sat there for a long moment, the phone still resting in my palm. There was no dread in my chest, no anticipation of confrontation, just a quiet readiness like the calm before inspection. Later that evening, Frank called me back. "They took the bait?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Then I'll coordinate on my end," he said. "You won't be alone in that room, Walter. But remember, speak only when necessary. Let the structure do the talking." "I understand," I told him, and I did. By the time Friday rolled around, the air in Elliot's home had shifted slightly. I could sense it even before arriving. The front door was open when I stepped onto the porch, something Miranda never allowed unless she wanted to look welcoming for an audience. She greeted me with a newly polished smile, voice smooth as ever. "Walter, come in. We're glad you agreed to this." Glad. The word hung loosely between us like a decoration rather than sincerity. Inside, the living room was arranged more formally than usual. Chairs aligned, a folder resting neatly on the coffee table, a legal pad beside it with crisp white pages untouched by pen. Miranda had dressed carefully, composed, businesslike. Elliot sat a few feet away, posture slightly stiff, hands clasped as though rehearsing calm. Her eyes held confidence. This was her arena, her setting, her design. "We thought it best to talk through everything together," she said, gesturing toward the seats. "So everyone feels heard." "I appreciate that," I replied, settling into the chair opposite her without haste. The consultant she'd mentioned arrived 10 minutes later, a middle-aged man with a briefcase and the polite stiffness of one who practiced professionalism like routine. Miranda greeted him warmly, perhaps too warmly, as if reassuring herself more than anything else. "This is Mr. Calloway," she said. "He's been guiding us through the transition process." I nodded once and said nothing. As the conversation began, Miranda took the lead effortlessly, explaining how I'd reached a point where independent living had its limitations, and how modern residences could offer community support and structured monitoring. She spoke in smooth sentences that never quite admitted what she intended, only what she wished to appear compassionate for suggesting. Elliot remained quiet beside her. I listened, patiently, without interruption. Every word was as rehearsed as I'd anticipated, and beneath that calm facade I watched carefully, not her expressions, but her posture, her cadence, the faint self-assurance in her movements. Miranda believed the ground beneath her plans was stable, that once she spoke clearly, the conclusion was inevitable, that I would agree, that I would accept the narrative she had constructed. But what she didn't notice, what never crossed her mind, was how deliberately ordinary I had acted, how careful my agreement had been, how calculated my vulnerability. This wasn't a confrontation, it was positioning. And as the consultant laid out the process of temporary relocation and legal reassignment for continuity, I folded my hands gently in my lap, allowing my silence to do exactly what she expected it to do. Nothing. Her confidence grew visibly stronger, and the more confident she grew, the more prepared the ground became beneath her certainty. The conversation moved forward the way Miranda had designed it to, structured, measured, and entirely in her control. Mr. Calloway slid a thin stack of papers onto the table and tapped the top page with his pen, speaking in polished tones about quality of care and advance planning. He avoided phrases like removal or displacement, favoring softer words that wrapped the decision in draped courtesy. Miranda nodded along, her hands folded neatly in her lap, posture straight with someone who believed every outcome had already been finalized. "We only want what's best for you, Walter," she said carefully, eyes lowering in a way that almost mimicked sympathy. These facilities provide supervision, companionship, medical attention on demand. You wouldn't be alone. I let her finish. I let the silence settle. Do I look unsafe to you? I asked quietly. It wasn't a challenge, not accusation, just a question held steady in the still air. Miranda tilted her head slightly, smile composed. This isn't about danger. It's about planning responsibly before a situation becomes dangerous. That's what we're trying to do, Dad, Elliot finally added, voice subdued, hesitant. His eyes remained fixed on the table as if the wood grain offered answers he wasn't prepared to speak aloud. Mr. Calloway adjusted his glasses. The documentation outlines a temporary transfer of residence status. Given the concerns raised by your family, this move would simply ensure your safety while preserving continuity of your assets. Assets. I allowed that word to float through the room unchallenged. And who raised these concerns? I asked. Miranda glanced sideways at Elliot, but her tone never flinched. We both did, she answered, because ignoring the reality of aging helps no one. The word aging carried weight in the way she used it, like an affidavit rather than a fact. I shifted slightly in my seat, joints responding slowly but surely. So your solution, I said calmly, is to remove me from the home I contributed to building and place me in care I never requested, under legal revision I never initiated? Miranda's brows lifted just faintly, pleased at my use of the word solution, as though my acknowledgement validated her process. It's not removal, she corrected. It's adjustment. And it's for your well-being. That's right, Elliot echoed quietly. We don't want anything bad happening to you, Dad. I turned my eyes to him then, not sharply, not accusingly, but with the gravity I once used when he was a child, unsure whether to tell me the truth. And when did you decide I was incapable of making that judgment for myself? I asked. His mouth parted, closed again. Miranda stepped forward before he could find his footing. Walter, this is not personal. This is practical. We love you, but the reality is you can't live alone forever. I nodded once, slowly. And when I signed the co-ownership agreement on this house 30 years ago, I replied, was that also practical or convenient? The room shifted subtly, a faint adjustment of balance I could feel long before anyone named it. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. Perhaps we should focus on the legal aspects of the process, he suggested, sensing tension that was not outward, but unmistakable. Miranda reached for the folder on the table and slid it toward me as though offering clarity rather than command. These documents simply formalize our intentions: temporary stay, medical oversight, and a streamlined transition in case circumstances change. I see, I murmured, not opening the file. And once I'm settled there, what becomes of my say in the house I still partially own? Her hand paused for just a second too long. Well, she replied evenly, it would be easier for everyone if decision-making remained consolidated under Elliot's authority. Authority. The word was uttered with such ease, as if she'd already rehearsed it in solitude. Silence fell. Mr. Calloway stopped writing. Elliot looked up for the first time, gaze unfocused, uncertain, like he stood at the edge of a choice he wasn't ready to claim. This isn't about taking control, Miranda said carefully. It's about shielding you from responsibilities you've earned the right to rest from. You mean shielding me from my own home? I replied softly. Her lips tightened, but the smile did not entirely disappear. It's what's best for everyone. You need rest, Walter. she added, firm now. Not responsibility, not decisions, not strain. You've done enough. The implication hung there. That I had become weight. That peace meant compliance. I leaned back slightly in my chair, gaze steady, unblinking. I had not raised my voice once, nor had my hands trembled. I felt no need to dominate the room. I simply observed them, two faces caught between justification and avoidance, and the more Miranda spoke, the more assured she appeared, which is precisely what made the next moment inevitable, because she had just enough confidence to believe this conversation belonged to her alone, and behind her certainty, a quiet knock echoed from the front door, not rushed, not abrupt, just deliberate, like procedure arriving right on time. The knock was not loud, yet it carried weight. Miranda turned her head first, irritation briefly flickering behind her polished expression, as though the interruption bruised her control of the moment. Elliot looked relieved, almost instinctively, while Mr. Calloway froze with his pen mid-air. "I wasn't expecting anyone else," Miranda said, rising slightly from her seat. "Neither was I," I replied calmly. She moved toward the door with practiced composure, forcing back the tension in her posture as she opened it. Standing on the threshold were two men, one in a neat gray suit holding a slim leather portfolio, the other familiar enough that I almost smiled despite the gravity of the moment. Frank Delaney stepped forward. His presence shifted the air instantly. He was not dramatic, not imposing by volume or theatrics, but there was authority in the way he carried himself, the same steadiness that had once kept platoons moving through uneven ground without announcement or hesitation. "Afternoon," Frank said, voice even, respectful but firm. "Walter Grayson is expecting us." Miranda blinked once, just slightly. "I'm afraid you must be mistaken. We're in the middle of a private discussion." Frank didn't waver. "This meeting concerns the potential reassignment of Mr. Grayson's residence and authority. As such, legal oversight has been requested." Mr. Calloway stepped forward, discomfort plain in the quick twitch of his expression. "I wasn't informed of additional counsel being involved." "That's not unusual," the man in the gray suit replied evenly. "Not when documentation is being reviewed under the possibility of misrepresented consent." The words landed cleanly. Misrepresented consent. Miranda's eyes flicked toward me, her composed smile finally thinning at the edges. "This is unnecessary," she said, adjusting her jacket slightly as if smoothing visible cracks. "We're proceeding through legitimate channels." "And so are we," Frank replied. "That's precisely why we're here." They entered the room quietly, without drama, and took the available seats opposite the coffee table. The dynamic shifted immediately, not through confrontation, but through presence alone. Procedure had arrived to inspect power. "I'll ask plainly," the gray-suited man continued, opening his portfolio. "Are any documents being prepared today under the assumption of Walter Grayson's consent or reduced capacity?" Miranda inhaled, slow and intentional. "We're discussing options for assisted living. That's all." "Then this will remain a discussion," Frank added, "until full verification of ownership structure and legal permissions has been concluded." Mr. Calloway cleared his throat again, now visibly cautious. "These forms have not yet been signed." "That's fortunate," Frank said simply. He turned his eyes toward me, nodding once, not affectionately, not emotionally, but with quiet assurance. "We've reviewed the property records," he continued, addressing the room. "Mr. Grayson still holds co-ownership status and retains legal authority over residency decisions. No relocation or alteration of living rights can proceed without his explicit, fully informed approval. Miranda's jaw tightened. Her hands remained folded, but not as calmly as before. "That's not entirely accurate," she interjected, voice slightly sharper now. "Our consultant has advised that family-driven transitions are acceptable in cases of diminished judgment." Frank's gaze sharpened. "And on what grounds has diminished judgment been medically verified?" Silence. Mr. Calloway shifted nervously. "There has been no formal diagnosis," Miranda admitted. "Then any attempt to suggest incapacity," the gray-suited man added, "constitutes procedural overreach." The room went still. Elliot's shoulders sagged noticeably. "And with regard to the property," Frank continued, sliding a document across the table, "the original agreement includes a clause requiring mutual consent for alteration of ownership hierarchy. That clause has not been satisfied." Miranda stared at the paper without touching it. "This seems overly technical," she said tightly. "We're trying to help." "You're attempting to restructure," Frank replied. "There is a difference." I remained silent. Not because I feared speaking, but because watching truth unfold through legal structure required no embellishment from my voice. "And finally," Frank added, locking eyes with Miranda, "any effort to transfer or limit Mr. Grayson's agency without verified consent could result in personal legal exposure." A faint tremor rippled through her expression, no longer polished, just bare. Elliot looked between her and me, confusion hardening into realization. He swallowed once, visibly unsettled. "You didn't tell me this part," he murmured under his breath. Miranda remained composed outwardly, but certainty no longer inhabited her posture. Nothing aggressive had been said, nothing loud. Yet the ground beneath her confidence had cracked open quietly, not through defiance, through documentation, through clarity, through consequence. And in the stillness that followed, as Frank folded his hands and Mr. Calloway stared down at his notes, I finally saw the flicker of something Miranda had not prepared for. Not anger, not outrage, but uncertainty. Because the narrative she believed she controlled was no longer hers to direct. The air in that living room felt thicker than it had any right to be. Not from shouting, not from confrontation, but from the quiet realization settling into Elliot's face as everything he thought was handling a situation began to look disturbingly like a scheme he'd walked into blind. He stared at the table, then at Miranda, then at Frank and the man with the portfolio. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since this mess began, he didn't look like a husband protecting his wife's plan. He looked like my son. "Miranda," he said slowly, voice low, careful. "You said this was about helping Dad, about simplifying things for him." "It still is," she replied quickly, but the calm had gone from her tone. "You're letting them frame this like something it's not." Frank remained still, hands folded, not interrupting. He didn't need to. The shift wasn't happening because of him. It was happening between two people who had to live with each other when this room was empty again. Elliot shook his head once, then again. "Frank just said you were trying to limit Dad's legal authority without medical proof," he murmured. "Is that true?" Miranda's eyes flashed. "You're twisting the language. I was acting in our best interest as a household." "Our best interest?" he echoed. "Or yours?" Her mouth opened, then closed. The silence that followed cut sharper than any accusation. The man in the gray suit slid another paper forward. "We have transcript verification of a message issued under Mrs. Grayson's account," he said clinically. Communicated to Mr. Grayson's phone. It read, and I quote, "Make sure he won't come back." Elliot went still. The room might as well have stopped breathing. His eyes shifted slowly toward Miranda, disbelief widening across his face like a slow fracture. "You wrote that?" he asked quietly. She stiffened. "That was taken out of context." "Taken out of—" His voice caught. "You told me you loved my father, that you just wanted him safe." "I wanted our home stable," she snapped, the Polish finally cracking into frustration. "You said yourself he was becoming difficult, forgetful." "I said he was getting older," Elliot replied. "Not that he needed to disappear." His eyes softened then, in a way that made my chest tighten just a little. "You planned this?" he asked, barely above a whisper now. "You were trying to push him out? Without telling me?" Miranda rose from her chair, hands spreading defensively. "I was trying to protect our future. That house is our foundation, and with your father still holding authority over parts of it. He built that house," Elliot cut in, voice rising despite his restraint. "He paid for half of it. He fixed it. He stood in that yard before we even owned the land." She hesitated. He looked at me then, and I saw what I hadn't seen in too long: shame. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I swear I didn't know it went this far." I held his gaze without responding, not because I wanted him to hurt, but because the truth wasn't something I wanted to soften. Miranda's eyes darted between us, her plan unraveling too fast for recalibration. "You're letting them manipulate you?" she insisted. "This was supposed to be sensitive, controlled." "Controlled for who?" he asked. "Because it sure wasn't for him." He gestured toward me, toward the chair I sat in, toward the life she'd tried to section off as excess. The man with the portfolio spoke again. "There is also indication of discussions regarding assisted relocation without legally authorized assessment." Elliot clenched his jaw now, the realization hardening into resolve. "You told me it was just a suggestion," he said. "A future possibility." "It was preventative," she argued weakly. "No," he replied, voice cutting through the room like a line drawn. "It looks like it was planned." Her composure collapsed completely then, even if she refused to acknowledge it. The woman who entered this confrontation confident and assured now stood reacting instead of directing. He turned fully toward her. "You said you cared about my family," he said. "Turns out you were trying to remove it." That was when she finally went silent, and I knew then that the weight had shifted. Not because I had demanded it, not because voices rose, but because the truth spoke plainly where it could no longer be denied. The lie had broken, and the man caught between loyalty and moral clarity had finally opened his eyes. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. I watched my son reckon with the reality of what had been done in his name, and for the first time since I'd read those words on his phone, "Make sure he won't come back," I saw him understand who those words were really meant to erase. Me. The room did not erupt. It just went still, and in that silence, the storm that had been building from quiet manipulation finally turned toward clarity. I had been silent for most of the evening, not because I didn't care, but because there are moments when words gain power only when they are withheld. I had let them speak. I had let the truth reveal itself without interference. And now, as the weight of understanding settled into the room, I knew the moment for speech had arrived, not to accuse, not to punish, and certainly not to beg. I leaned forward slightly in the chair, resting both hands on the polished wood of the table. The movement alone drew their eyes back to me, not as a problem to manage or a presence to tolerate, but as the man who had just endured being quietly erased. "I'm going to say something once," I said calmly. No anger sharpened the words, no drama clung to the edges, just a steady tone, practiced through years of order and restraint. Miranda stiffened. Elliot looked toward me, uncertainty still clouding his expression. Frank remained still, attentive. "This isn't about property or paperwork," I continued. "It's not even about who wrote what message or who misused which power. What you tried to do, Miranda, was not efficiency. It was not concern. It was a decision made without my voice, about my life." She started to speak, but I raised my hand gently. "And this moment is not about shaming you," I added. "It's about removing confusion from me, from this home, from the man who sits beside you and calls me father." Elliot swallowed. I saw his eyes pleading now, not for forgiveness, but for stability, for understanding, for the ground to stop shifting beneath him. "The home you live in," I said slowly, "was never meant to be leverage. It was meant to be shelter, a space built on shared effort and mutual respect. When I signed my name beside yours, son, it wasn't paper I was trusting. It was blood." His eyes dropped. "And just as quietly as I once gave support, I will now take back authority," I murmured, my voice firm but not raised. "Not as retaliation, not as punishment, but because anyone who confuses silence for weakness needs a lesson in clarity." I turned my gaze toward Miranda. "You don't get to plan a man's removal from his own foundation and call it care. You don't get to whisper disappearance and hide behind soft language, and you do not get to sit in the center of a life you tried to silence." The room was absolute stillness now, not explosive, not bitter, just resolved. "I am not walking away," I finished quietly. "I am reclaiming my place, with dignity, with deliberation, and without apology." Elliot looked up then, eyes filled with the regret of a son who had allowed someone else to speak where he should have listened. "I should have seen it sooner," he said softly. "Yes," I replied. That was all. No comfort in it. No cruelty either. Just the truth spoken at last. Frank nodded once in silent agreement, and the man in the suit began quietly gathering his papers, now instruments of correction rather than evidence of betrayal. Miranda said nothing. She had no script left to follow, no position left to maintain. Her plan had collapsed, not from force, but from exposure. And as I leant back into the chair again, my spine straight, my breath steady, I knew that this room no longer housed a misunderstanding. It now held a reckoning, and beyond that, something far more necessary. Distance, boundaries, authority, all reclaimed without raising my voice, just as it should have been from the beginning. Miranda did not cry. She did not raise her voice or collapse into dramatics. Instead, she sat frozen in the quiet she could no longer control, the silence that follows when someone realizes the floor beneath their authority has given way. Her eyes moved restlessly around the room as though searching for an exit that didn't exist. Not a door, but an advantage. A sentence she could still twist. A tone she could still use to regain command. But the balance had shifted, not by confrontation, not by control, but by truth. "You're both overreacting," she finally said, her voice lower now, more cautious than before. The confidence that once made her words sharp now dulled into something defensive, almost rehearsed. This whole situation got misinterpreted. I was trying to spare him stress, that's all. I met her eyes without emotion. You attempted to decide my absence in advance, I replied simply. That is not sparing, that is erasure. She frowned. You're twisting things. No, I said quietly. I'm naming them. Elliot didn't look at her now. His gaze rested somewhere on the tabletop, burdened by the realization that for months, maybe longer, he had allowed Miranda's voice to drown his own judgment. You didn't even discuss it with me, he muttered under his breath. You just told me what would happen. I did what I thought was best, she insisted, though the justification no longer rang with certainty. I never asked you to decide when my father would stop being part of my life, he replied, voice flat with suppressed pain. Frank remained neutral, watching the exchange without intrusion, but the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Miranda's words held no more weight. Even when she tried to press them forward, they collapsed before gaining momentum. You always said we needed stability, she added, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. You said the house was our future. And you took that to mean you could erase the past to better serve it? I asked calmly. Her jaw tightened. I didn't realize he'd get so emotional about this, she muttered, perhaps unaware of how small such a remark sounded in the room it echoed through. I wasn't emotional, I corrected. I was observant. Those words landed quietly, but with finality. No one rushed to defend her. Not Elliot, not Frank, not the law clerk. The power she once wielded in that home, through charm, persuasion, timing, had dissolved into cautious response. What happens now? She asked tightly, eyes narrowing slightly, chin lifting as if posture alone could restore the lost footing. Now? I echoed. Now you live with the consequences of having mistaken authority for partnership. Elliot shifted slightly, his fingers gripping the arms of the chair as if grounded by their presence. You crossed a line, he said, turning toward her, and I can't pretend we just step over that. A flicker of disbelief passed over her face. So you're choosing him over me? She snapped. That's not what this is, he replied, a trace of exhaustion in his voice. This is about knowing who pushed for removal and who stayed quiet long enough to let it happen. She said nothing more after that. The room had changed shape. Where she once directed conversation, she now responded to it. Where she planned outcomes, she now absorbed them. And where her quiet manipulation once erased me behind polite concern, it now revealed the emptiness behind her control. I did not rejoice in her fall, not for a second. This was no victory ceremony, no moment of satisfaction. It was simply a recalibration of roles, of respect, of center. She had attempted to remove me from the home I helped create, and instead she found herself no longer occupying the one position she had taken for granted, the center of control. And as I watched the recognition settle across her face, I felt no pride, only a calm confirmation that the balance had returned to where it belonged, grounded, clear, and no longer governed by quiet coercion. The meeting did not end with slammed doors or raised voices. It ended the way most truths do when they've finally been allowed to breathe, with silence and space. Frank gathered his documents, offering nothing more than a curt nod before stepping toward the door. The man with the portfolio followed him, his presence no longer required now that clarity had replaced confusion. Their work was done. They had not delivered justice, they had simply illuminated it, and what remained was far more difficult. family. Elliot stayed seated long after Miranda rose from the table. She didn't storm out. She didn't plead. She simply moved away, her heels quiet against the floor, retreating to the back bedroom like someone unsure where they were still allowed to belong. I did not watch her go. My focus stayed on my son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the young man who still remembered how to hold a fishing line steady with two shaking hands, the father who had let the wrong voice guide him out of fear rather than malice. "I'm sorry," he said eventually, his voice barely above breath. "I didn't know how far she was willing to go. I should have protected you." "You should have listened," I replied quietly. He nodded, not defensively, not resentfully, just as a man humbled by the realization that silence had cost him more than he ever expected. "I should have stood between you and this," he said, eyes cast down. "I thought I was being supportive. Instead, I let her turn concern into control." "You can choose differently now," I answered. "But don't pretend time rewinds just because regret has arrived." He absorbed that in silence. "No one's asking for perfection," I added. "Just honesty, and the courage to stand up when something feels wrong, even if it's your own home shifting under you." He looked up at me then, eyes rimmed not with tears, but with a familiar grief, the kind that lingers when trust bruises instead of shatters. "I won't push you," he said. "I'll earn back whatever space you allow." I studied him for a long moment. "There will be boundaries," I said. "Clear ones, for a while." "I understand." "And they're not temporary," I continued. "They're a reset." He didn't argue. "I won't be erased again," I finished simply. He nodded once more. "I don't want you gone, Dad," he whispered, even if she thought that was best. "I know," I said, and I believed him. The silence that followed felt different than the one that had filled the house before. Not cold, not sharp, just cautious, like a wound covered carefully instead of ignored. Miranda didn't return to the living room again that night, and when I stepped outside into the quiet evening air, the sky already dimming into pale blue, Elliot walked me to my car without a word spoken between us. Before I got in, he touched my shoulder. "Thank you for not walking away," he said quietly. I looked at him once. "I didn't come to be welcomed," I replied. "I came to be clear." And that difference, I suspected, would stay with him long after I drove away. The road home passed in gentle silence, the kind that lets thought rise and settle without urgency. Streetlights flickered past my windshield, distant and steady, mirroring the calm slowly returning to my chest. Not peace, but progress. And sometimes that is enough to rebuild the ground beneath your feet. When I reached my drive, I lingered in the car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing in the stillness of the night my life insisted on offering once more. I had not won, I had not punished, I had reclaimed. And somewhere, deep beneath fatigue and restraint, a quiet certainty remained that this was the balance that should have existed all along. The world did not change because I walked away from that house with steadier footing. It turned the same the next morning. The sun rose over the same rooftops. The kettle whistled just as it always had. My knees still ached when I stood too quickly. Time moved forward with no regard for family tension or quiet reckoning, and for the first time in a very long while, I was grateful for that. My life did not need upheaval to feel meaningful. It needed structure, routine, something steady to return to when emotion threatened to cloud judgment. So I went back to where I had always found my sense of usefulness, the veteran's workshop. The old metal gate groaned as I pushed it open, its familiar resistance anchoring me moment by moment. Inside, the scent of oil and worn rubber wrapped around the space like a quiet memory. Tools hung exactly where they belonged, each with its place, each with its purpose, as it should be. "Morning, Mr. Halbrook," Jonah called from beneath the hood of a battered pickup, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag. "We finally got the clutch working on that old thing." "Good," I replied, tying the apron around my waist with slow precision. "Don't let a small victory make you careless." He grinned. "Never." Around me, the room stirred to life. Young men and women who carried their own burdens nodded toward me, some offering quiet greetings, others focused already on the work that grounded them. They did not see me as a burden. They saw me as someone who showed up. That mattered. I spent the better part of the morning walking between bays, offering advice only when needed, listening more than speaking. Every turn of a wrench felt more deliberate now, not mechanical, but intentional. I wasn't here to escape the truth. I was here to honor it. During a brief break, I stepped outside to stretch my back. The air smelled faintly of grass and warm asphalt, the kind that reminds you life continues regardless of your personal storms. Frank's words echoed faintly in my mind: legal authority, boundaries, consent. These were things I had too long taken for granted in the family space I once believed unconditional. But the longer I stood there, breathing in the clear air, the more it dawned on me that I hadn't lost anything. I had simply reclaimed the right to determine my own routine without guilt, to leave without arguing, to arrive without explanation, to be present without needing permission. A man named Harris, who'd once served under my supervision years ago, stopped beside me with a soft grin. "Heard what happened at your son's place," he said quietly, not probing, just acknowledging. "Did you?" I replied. "You kept your composure. That counts for something around here." I nodded. "Composure isn't restraint. It's resolve held at the right temperature." He smiled faintly. "Sounds about right, sir." The afternoon passed with quiet precision. No bitterness bled into my hands. No anger shaped my posture. Only clarity. And by the time evening arrived, I realized something far more important than the confrontation itself had occurred. I had chosen peace not because the situation settled, but because I stopped waiting for anyone else to validate it. My phone buzzed once while I was gathering my gloves. A simple message. "Elliot, I hope you're well. No pressure, just checking in." I didn't reply immediately, not because I was punishing him, but because stability grows through silence just as much as it does through conversation. And when I shut off the shop lights and stepped into the cooling dusk, I felt more grounded than I had in years. Not triumphant, not vengeful, just certain. Certain that steady hands, bound by discipline and guided by dignity, could still build something worthwhile, even after the foundation had been tested. And I walked to my car with that certainty resting comfortably where anxiety used to be. A quiet strength, earned, and once again, fully my own. Section 15. Closure. Reclaimed identity. I turned 75 last spring. I didn't celebrate it. No candles, no fuss. Just a quiet dinner and the steady comfort of knowing I had reached a point in life where I no longer needed performance to feel alive. I had spent decades being useful, dependable, disciplined, not because applause demanded it, but because that was who I had chosen to be. And now, after everything that had unfolded, that choice felt more clearly mine than ever before. The house that once felt like a place of erasure no longer held any power over my sense of self. The photo frames on my own shelves, the creak of my floorboards, the kettle's soft whistle at dawn, those were my markers of identity. My life didn't need reclaiming through confrontation. It had already reclaimed itself through quiet persistence. In the days that followed, I saw Elliot a few times from a distance, not physically, but in the small ways he reached out, carefully, respectfully. No urgency, no emotional leverage. He was learning, slowly, what it meant to honor silence instead of fill it. And maybe, in time, that space would open just enough for conversation to breathe again. But I did not rush it. Healing that arrives too quickly often slips away just as fast. Instead, I found peace in the small certainties of my day. A repaired engine purring back to life, a young veteran steadying his first bolt, a shared joke over worn coffee cups. Moments that didn't need anyone's approval to feel honest. I began walking more in the early mornings when the streets were still empty and the sky stretched wide with pale light. Each step reminded me I was still here, not fading, not being replaced, not disappearing quietly the way Miranda had once assumed. I was not vanishing. I was standing still long enough to see clearly. A neighbor once asked, "You doing all right these days, Hal Brooke?" I smiled faintly. Better than fine. And I meant it. Not because things had been fixed, but because I had been restored to a place inside myself that no one else was entitled to disturb. There is no dramatic ending to this story. No final embrace, no sweeping reconciliation, just a man who chose dignity over urgency, clarity over comfort, and boundaries over emotional bargaining. And that, after 75 years of living, serving, sacrificing, and enduring, felt like the most honest victory I could claim. I was not erased. I was refined. And finally, I was living not as a father seeking inclusion, but as a man who knew where he stood, quietly, firmly, on ground no one else could move without permission. Before you go, let me ask you this. Have you ever discovered someone close to you quietly planning your absence? And if so, would you have stayed silent or drawn the line the way I did? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this story resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you never miss a new upload. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Our other stories are appearing on screen right now. Tap 1 to keep watching, and I'll see you tomorrow at the same time with a brand new story.